mentioned, we've been doing this since 1998. I was part of the theater company that started this. Our normal tour is about a 3-hour tour. We go to 3 different bars. We have a round in each. We tell some stories. We share some snippets of some of the stuff that happened in the bar in that area, and then we'll perform some of their work. We're going to do a shorter version of that now. I do have a little bit of a slideshow we'll periodically go up to, but being our first time, it's a little loose. And we were all just commenting earlier that we're probably more nervous doing this than we have doing it in front of an audience before with the new technology.
That's true.
So I hope bear with us for kind of learning this, but we are going to try to keep it at around 40 minutes, 45 minutes of material, and then allow some time for some questions. Obviously, our focus is more of the literary and the bar history as it's come around. And if you want to get a sense of our qualifications, we are a pub crawl with literature, but we are very passionate about what we do. And that being said, should introduce myself. Obviously, I'm Eric. I'm one of the founding members. I'm joined by Danielle, who's been a guide for years. She was on hiatus for a while, and now she's back trying to help us out with some of our social media and marketing promotion. She also works for the Drama League and just was really one of the creations of the Gratitude Awards that happened last night, as they had to do a massive pivot during this pandemic and also take their event to virtual as well. So we're really happy to have her involved, and she's a great asset. And then we also have Justin. So that being said, I think that we should start out at the White Horse Tavern. And I would normally say we should start with a toast, but unfortunately I didn't really bring a beer. So I think I failed us on.
No, that's okay. That's okay, Eric. I actually have a drink for you. Do you have a glass? I have a glass for you too.
Oh,
this is one of our pub crawl glasses. Here, let me just, maybe I can just, I have a pretty good internet connection. Let me just see if I can get that to you.
Wow.
There we go. All right. Very good. Very good. Also, I have a beer. Do you want a nondescript beer? Hold on.
Yeah, nondescript is my favorite.
Hold on. Hold on. Let me see if I can pour this for you. You ready? You ready?
Yeah.
You have a glass? All right. Good.
Easy.
Good.
Okay.
And how about there? How's that?
All right. Cheers. All right.
All right. Nice. Very good. Very good. I have my beer too.
Cheers and welcome.
Odd that it has so much foam. It's so weird that it has so much foam.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh.
Here's to lying, cheating, stealing, and drinking. When you lie, lie to save a friend. When you cheat, cheat death. When you steal, steal the heart of another. And when you drink, think of us. Cheers.
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 And that being said, we are starting at the White Horse Tavern. And I'm going to share my screen here. The sharing has failed to start. Let's try again later. All right. That's exciting. I will try again later. So we're going to start at the White Horse Tavern. Now, the building itself was built in 1817, according to the Greenwich Village Society records. Here we go. We'll refer to them as the Society moving forward, but we went through some of their archives here. We have a few pictures of this place from the 1960s. What's interesting is that when it was built in 1817, assuming that is correct, it is the first building to have been built on the newly extended Hudson Street. So this is from 1811, this map right here. And Hudson Street for a long time ended right here at Christopher Street. And then in 1816, they got permission to extend the Hudson Street all the way up to what was Greenwich Lane at that time. So it ended up extending up this way. So in 1817, this would have been a fairly new street on Hammond Street. So it would have been right about this area here that the White Horse Tavern would have been built. It was built for Daniel D. Smith, who was a bookseller. We don't have any pictures of him, so here's a picture of me with a mustache as a placeholder. But he was a bookseller, but he was also apparently he was authorized to be a bit of a peddler of some quack heal-all medicines. He got connected with James Morrison, who was a British doctor and scientist, who felt that he'd created an herbal pill that was made entirely of vegetables that was a cure-all. And so this began sweeping the 1830s for a while. And yes, there's some of our polls right there. I can't even click it. But he was such a quack doctor that they even started to show some concerns for overdosing. Come on, why aren't you not advancing on me here? And this is, of course, one of the comics that came out when people were concerned that they might overdose on the vegetable pills. But it was later in the 1940s where it became more of a literary hangout. But we did find a couple of interesting residents in the early 1900s. There was a boxer, Johnny Gorman, who lived in the apartment. there, and he was a boxer. He, like many boxers, he was a bit violent, especially when he'd been drinking, and he was living with his wife and mother-in-law, and apparently he was roughing up his wife a little too much, and the mother-in-law would have nothing to do with it, and she started throwing plates, as this depiction shows, and hitting him with a frying pan until he was huddled under a table, begging for mercy while the cops were being called to take him in. So it's had a couple of interesting residents in that sense. And then from there, we obviously have Jane Jacobs here, who was a real, obviously, I'm sure most of you know, is one of the reasons why the village is what it is today. She managed to save the village and keep it as it is, since this is her in 1961 sitting next to apparently a Jawa from Star Wars. But there's so many writers that attended there. You had James Baldwin went there, Anais Nin. You had the Clancy brothers. This is actually a picture of them in the middle room of the White Horse Tavern. But of all of the writers that went there, probably the most fun to talk about is a poet who was described by a friend as being an amicable but puffy frog.
Yes. Dylan Thomas, he once said that I hold a beast, an angel, and a madman in me, and my inquiry is as to their working, and my problem is their subjugation and victory, down throw and upheaval, and my effort is their self-expression.
Basically, that means that he was hearing voices, lots and lots of voices. That's what that means, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He had many highs and many lows, but he traveled frequently. He'd actually make money as quickly as he spent it, mostly in bars. He did several tours of America, and he would actually go on tour reading poetry and would have an audience of fans waiting for him. Pretty much can be considered like the original rock star, like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Or as I like to think about it for him, whiskey, barbiturates, and poetry.
Which is kind of redundant. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, whiskey, barbiturates, poetry. It's they're interchangeable.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, fair. But he once actually said about himself that he was the drunkest man in the entire world. He visited New York City frequently. It was actually on his a fourth tour that we are specifically going to discuss a little bit of. But he would always stop into the White Horse Tavern first when he came to New York. A lot of the patrons in the White Horse Tavern were working men out on the docks, and it's thought that Dylan Thomas felt at home in this bar because it reminded him of the type of bars that were in his homeland of Wales. But unfortunately, this was also one of the last stops of his life.
Sorry, dramatic music. Last stop of his life. Go ahead.
It was on November 3rd, 1953, his fourth tour of the U.S., and it was only a few days after his 39th birthday when he went into the White Horse Tavern and got very drunk. And he stumbled back to the Chelsea Hotel where he was staying with a woman named Liz Rytel, who he was having an affair with. And he walks into the room and goes, 18 whiskeys, a record, methinks. Passed out asleep on the bed. He woke up the next morning, probably very hungover, and decided that the best thing to do to cure it would be to walk back to the White Horse Tavern and have a couple of hair of the dog beers.
Ease yourself back into sobriety, sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can't go too quickly. No, that's bad for your system. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was bad for his system. He allegedly walked outside down to the corner and fell into the snowbank unconscious. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital, and it was there a few days later where he died. According to his death certificate, it said that he officially died of insult to the brain, which is fancy autopsy speak. Apparently his liver was in surprisingly good condition.
Oh, well, that's because it was pickled, right? I mean, that's how that works. You drink enough and your inside organs, certain ones get pickled. Pickled, right? Pickled?
Yeah.
Pickled.
Yeah. But it was later assumed that it was chronic alcohol poisoning that was actually the cause of his death.
Cheers.
Or, as a lot of people like to say, that Dylan Thomas died of being Dylan Thomas. He wrote many great poems, but probably the one that he's most famous for is the one that he wrote for his dying father.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced on a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men, who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on your sad height curse, bless me now with your fierce tears. I pray do not go gentle into that good night, but rage, rage against the dying of the light. Dylan Thomas.
Very well done. There's a little shot of his funeral there. The snapping actually is a fun side story because it's believed to come from Greenwich Village as well. The Gaslight Cafe over on McDougal Street was a common place for poetry readings through the 50s and 60s, and the neighborhood was really upset about the raucous, wild poets and their partying habits that were going on down there, and especially the loud applause that would happen after all the poems. So instead of shutting themselves down, as the neighborhood was trying to do, instead they instituted the snapping. And right next to the Gaslight Cafe was, of course, the original location for the Kettle of Fish.
Yes, yes, Kettle of Fish. Kettle of Fish is going to be our next bar that we're going to talk about. Moving along, if you can picture, if you will, in your brain, walking along to the Kettle of Fish. We should do another
toast.
Toast
to bar two. I hope people aren't drinking too fast here.
It's true.
Get around.
Wait. But I already did a shot. I don't have another drink.
Oh, that's true. Danielle doesn't have a drink. We have our beers.
Justin, can you get me a drink?
Through the magic of, well, actually, I mean, I actually only have the one glass. Eric, do you think you could help Danielle out with something?
Guys, I'm so sorry.
Not at all.
Or a martini? I have an emergency martini that I keep in my desk periodically in case of a situation.
Oh, right. Eric's emergency martini.
Break open the fire extinguisher there and the wood glue out of the way. And
there we go. Emergency martini.
A martini just for you. Careful.
There we go.
Thank
Very nice.
you.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Cheers, everybody.
Clever. Cheers.
I love to have a martini. 2 at the very most. 3, I'm under the table. And 4, I'm under the host.
Oh.
Cheers, Dorothy Parker. Well done.
Dorothy Parker. Indeed.
So welcome to the Kettle of Fish. It's historically 3 bars in one: the Lion's Head, the Monkey's Paw, and Kettle of Fish. So we're going to start at the Lion's Head. It was run from 1966 to 1993 by Judy and Wes Joyce. Wes was a retired NYPD police officer. And this was the city's premier watering hole for all sorts of journalists, from mainstream newspapers to the Village Voice, who had their office next door. And they would go to celebrate birthdays and, sadly, even deaths, and most importantly, Pulitzer Prizes. Bar patrons include all sorts of people, from famous names from literature, politics, music, art. Langford Wilson was a regular here, and he could often be seen scribbling down scenes from his plays in the corner. Jessica Lange reportedly worked as a waitress, and others included James Baldwin, Norman Mailer, Lou Reed, Bob Dylan, Pete Hamill, and of course Frank McCourt.
I'm glad you mentioned Frank McCourt. Frank McCourt, we all know who Frank McCourt is, but when Frank McCourt was going to the Lion's Head, he was going as sort of a writer's groupie. Going to see all his heroes who would go and hang out at the Lion's Head. In fact, we know about him because of Angela's Ashes. And there was a story about Frank McCourt, is that he was being interviewed by a reporter soon after he wrote Angela's Ashes, and the reporter asked him a question about his time writing. Did he know that he was writing a best-selling novel? And thinking, of course, that Frank McCourt was going to say no, but Frank McCourt said immediately, unequivocally, yes, I did know I was writing a best-selling novel. And the reporter said, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? How could you possibly have known while you were writing it that you were writing a best-selling novel? And Frank McCourt said, well, you have to understand that I was a teacher, and teachers don't get paid a whole heck of a lot, and the writing was full time. And so while writing Angela's Ashes, I had a good hard look at my finances, and I thought to myself, this absolutely has to be a best-selling novel. Frank McCourt was one of the groups of writers. Well, really, so many people were invited back down to the Lion's Heads during its final week to come and have a final drink there, say hello and goodbye to the bar and to everybody, all the regulars and friends that were made there. And Frank McCourt wrote a eulogy to the bar, part of which this is what he said. He said that my home away from home was the Lion's Head Bar down on Christopher Street. I went there on its opening night. It was a great gathering place for writers and poets and journalists. Norman Mailer would come in the early years, Bob Dylan, the Clancy brothers, Pete Hamill, Lanford Wilson, and Amiri Baraka, the playwright, the poet whose name used to be Leroy Jones. Bobby Kennedy came in one night, and they went into the men's room and they erased all the graffiti, which was terrible because there was such wonderful graffiti in the men's room, but they erased it all because they wanted it to look respectable for Bobby. And one piece of graffiti was one that I'll never forget. It said, "My mother made me a homosexual." And underneath that it was scrawled, "Ooh, if I get her wool, will she make me one too?"
Frank McCourt. You know, we mentioned Pete Hamill here. Here's a shot with Pete Hamill, Frank McCourt, Judy Joyce, and some other guy. Pete Hamill wrote a book about called A Drinking Life, which is about his time being an artist in Greenwich Village at that time. And also it's about his time as a drinker and then trying to quit drinking. Excuse me.
Oh, yes, that's a good time.
Cheers, it's good stuff. But he wrote a little quote about the Lion's Head, and he said, "I don't think many New York bars ever had such a glorious mixtures of newspapermen, painters, musicians, seamen, ex-communists, priests and nuns, athletes and stockbrokers, politicians and folk singers, bound together by the leveling democracy of drink."
I love that, leveling democracy of drink. That's great.
I really love Some Guy. So speaking of Some Guy, not the same guy, but I'm really excited to share this story as we transition into our second bar, The Monkey's Paw. This is probably one of my favorite tales that we tell. So there's another literary bar here that was actually named after a pseudonym from a novel inspired by none other than Kinky Friedman. If you are not familiar with who Kinky Friedman is, he is a true Renaissance man. He is a singer, a writer, a politician, a humorist. He hails from Texas, and he's actually run for office multiple times. He has a band called Kinky Friedman and the Texas Jew Boys, and one of their hit songs is "They Ain't Making Jews Like Jesus Anymore." So I like to imagine that Kinky Friedman is the patron saint of Weird Al. Kinky always wanted to be a serious writer, and during the 80s he spent a fair amount of time in the bar writing dime store detective novels, starring a detective named Kinky Friedman himself, who would hang out in the bars and chat up the ladies and drink and then talk to all of the drunken regulars and, you know, like solve murders as detectives do, I think, on Law and Order. And
that's how I solve murders too, by the way. I solve it in the same exact way. The best way to solve murders is to just bar hop, drink, talk to people.
And that's the book cover. If you're ever able to find one of these books, they're like so rare now. They're not a literary classic, but they are very interesting for us to read because he describes the scene so accurately and names all of the literary and historic bars at the time and all of the people. And he was doing this so well that actually Wes Joyce had to say, hey, like you can't say that you're in the Lion's Head. And that may or may not have been because there was a fair amount of drug sales and drug use in the bathroom. And since Wes was a retired cop, there were a lot of NYPD regulars. So he said, okay, I'm going to change the name from the Lion's Head to the Monkey's Paw. And there it was born. So after the Lion's Head closed, some folks decided to buy the bar. They were huge literary fans and named their bar the Monkey's Paw. It was short-lived, though.
It's a shame that they weren't as clever with their finances as they were with their naming of bars, but they were keeping the tradition of certain illegal drugs that were not going, that were not supposed to be talked about there at the Lion's Head. The Kettle of Fish, which is there now, here's a picture of its original location over on McDougal Street next to the Gaslight Cafe. And it was a big hangout for the Beat members at that time. And the reason it's where it is now is really due to Patrick Daly. So Patrick Daly is the current owner of the bar. And he moved to New York City in 1980. And it began with a long weekend bus trip where he was just coming to visit some friends for the weekend. He had $40 in his pocket, and he never left because he was so taken up with all of the cross-cultural mix and the life and the energy that was happening here. So he couch surfed for a while and eventually became a bartender here at the Kettle of Fish on McDougal Street. When they moved over to 3rd Street as a second location. And when they moved, they apparently had a fallout with the owner of the building. The owner of the bar and the owner of the building did not get along so well, to such a point that when the last day and they left the bar, the owner of the building literally dragged the physical bar out into the street in the middle of McDougal Street, pulled out a chainsaw and hacked it up in front of everyone to show his disgust with the owners of the Kettle of Fish. They moved over to the 3rd Street location, and then the owners were getting rid of the bar. Patrick bought the name and decided to find a new location so he could keep the liquor license, find a new location for the bar. And he said he started on the southern tip of Broadway and worked his way up and wrote down any address that he thought might be a viable option for a bar. And did a lot of cold calls, got a lot of hang-ups and some rude answers. And at one point he decided to call the woman who owns the building that the Monkey's Paw was in and said, no offense to the Monkey's Paw, but if by any chance, they're going to leave, I hope you'd consider us as a potential renter. And the receptionist said, can you hold for a second? And he waited for a couple of minutes, and the receptionist came back and she said, well, the city just padlocked the door this morning. Can you come by and look this afternoon? So perfect timing for Patrick. And he, of course, moved it over to its current location now. Here's a couple other shots over at McDougal Street. There's a very famous shot of Jack Kerouac. This neon lit bar sign still exists in the basement of the Kettle of Fish now. That's sort of our photo op moment. This picture was used by Gap for a while in the late 90s and early aughts to sell khakis, because he was, of course, wearing khakis. And there's Joyce Johnson there in the background, who was often photoshopped out, which was a bit of a complaint of hers and several of the other supernumeraries of the Beat movement. Here again, you have Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky. Can never pronounce his name sober. But apart from that,
Eric, I was going to say I'm mostly impressed that you just used the word supernumeraries. That was quite something. That was surprising.
Last word before the show. I have to sound intellectual.
Yeah, you haven't had enough beer.
The Kettle of Fish is also a site for a couple of famous beatings, if you will, fights by Beat members or inspired by the Beat members. One, of course, was a very violent fight that happened between Jack Kerouac, Gregory Corso, and several furniture movers, which he had written about, which was a very violent fight that spilled out into the street. Kerouac was known for alienating people when he gets drunk and did so there at the Kettle of Fish. But there was also a fight between two other sort of fringe Beat members, a fight between these two bruisers of Andy Warhol and Bob Dylan. And as you take a look at these the beastly figures of
look at those physiques,
muscularity, you can imagine just
built
how
for fighting. That's what you think. Built for fighting when you look at the two of them.
There's two variations of this fight that were both told to me by eyewitnesses. One is that it actually came to blows, where Bob Dylan walked in, saw Andy Warhol sitting next to Edie Sedgwick, the woman who was the center of this fight. And Bob Dylan rolled up his sleeves and Andy Warhol snapped on his fighting wig and they stood up and it went to blows, which is probably not true and more along the lines of the, not the hands, not the face kind of a fight. But the other eyewitness account is a little bit more like the ending of the movie The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, where Bob Dylan walks into the bar, sees Andy Warhol, and glares at Andy Warhol.
Andy Warhol, who's still wearing his fighting wig, looks at Bob Dylan and glares right back at him.
And then Bob Dylan steps back and, of course, slowly slides his chair outside of the picture and exits the Kettle of Fish. And that's probably the more realistic version of...
It's a very accurate portrayal we just did, too.
Yeah, exactly. But, of many members of the Beat that were participants in the Kettle of Fish, there was one who was both a regular at the Kettle of Fish and the Lion's Head, as Justin had mentioned earlier, which is a poet, Leroy Jones, who later changed his name to Amiri Baraka.
So yeah, Amiri Baraka is one of the beats who is usually not spoken about in the first breath when you start talking about the beats. Everybody thinks about obviously Corso and Ginsberg and Kerouac and Burroughs and the rest of them. But Amiri Baraka first got involved in the beat movement when he read Ginsberg's Howl. And Howl was published. He read it. He was so inspired, so moved. He grabbed the first writing surface, piece of paper, whatever it was, in order to write Allen Ginsberg a note. He needed to make contact with this genius who wrote Howl. And so Amiri Baraka grabbed some toilet paper and wrote on the toilet paper and basically saying, "Are you for real?" And then sent that to Ginsberg. And Ginsberg got this very strange letter written on toilet paper, "Are you for real?" And he was moved to write back, basically, "Yes, I'm for real. I'm really here. I wrote this poem." And this got a correspondence going between the two of them, and Ginsberg is who introduced Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, to the rest of the beats. Amiri Baraka also ran some literary publications, and he got involved with and got to know Diane DePrima very well as well. I should also mention that Amiri Baraka is this funny little story. He was arrested in the riots in Newark, and this was in the late 60s, around 1967, for illegally possessing firearms. And at his court trial, his poem, the judge read one of his poems. Is quite possibly the only time that a modern American poet landed in prison, because it was one of his poems. And I'm going to read this to make sure I got it right. The judge read this during the trial and thought this was very damning, and said, part of the poem, the line from the poem was, "All the stores will open if you say the magic words. And the magic words are, up against the wall, mother effer, this is a stick up." And that was so, inflammatory that the judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison for his holding of firearms. And this was his intention. And he's obviously somebody who shouldn't be in society. Luckily, that was overturned on appeal. And Baraka was allowed to rejoin his friends and continue writing poetry. One of his more famous poems, however, is a preface to a 20-volume suicide note, which goes like this.
Lately, I've become accustomed to the way the ground opens up and envelops me each time I go out to walk the dog, or the broad-edged silly music the wind makes when I run to catch a bus. Things have come to that. And now each night I count the stars, and each night I get the same number. And when the stars will not come out to be counted, I count the holes they leave. Nobody sings anymore. And then, last night, I walked by my daughter's bedroom, and I heard her talking to someone. But when I opened the door, there was nobody there, only she on her knees, peeking into her own clasped hands. Amiri Baraka.
Amiri Baraka.
And I love that poem because it has such beautiful sadness, and it's such a sad poem that ends with that childish hopelessness and magic that only a child can bring. With that, we now go to our last stop, which is, of course, Marie's Crisis Cafe.
Yes, Marie's Crisis. Does everybody have you have a drink? Does anybody need any another toast? Maybe here. Let me actually add some more. Well, I'll just finish the bottle into here. There we go. Yes, a toast. How about this? Some Guinness was spilt on the barroom floor when the pub was shut for the night, when out of his hole crept a wee brown mouse, and he stood in the pale moonlight. He lapped up the frothy foam, and then back in his haunches he sat. And all night long, you could hear the mouse roar, "Bring on the goddamn cat!"
Cheers.
Yeah, Marie's Crisis. Marie's Crisis is, if you've been, it's a great bar. Love that bar. It's an interesting building too. It's one of the older buildings in the village. The building that Marie's Crisis Cafe is in was built late 30s, so about 1830. Late 30s. They say late 30s. 1839, not 1930s.
2:30 this afternoon, I think. Yeah, it's just...
Right, exactly. It's about 2:30s, 2:30, 3:30, and It replaced a farmhouse. There was a farmhouse in that area from about the 1700s, if you can imagine, a little farm going on there. And it's thought that maybe the part of the foundation of the Maria's Crisis building incorporated the foundation of that old farmhouse. So it's possible that the foundation is older than the building itself. Let's see. Also, the beams in Maria's Crisis, much like the beams in a lot of the older buildings in the area, if you take a look at them, they're wood from decommissioned ships on the Hudson. You know, being a port town, of course, we have all these ships. Once a ship is done sailing, you have all this extra wood, and so a lot of the wood was incorporated into the buildings in the area, which I think is really, really cool. The name Marie's in Marie's Crisis, the name Marie's, of course, refers to Marie Dumont. Marie Dumont was a French Austrian who. Well, I missed what just happened. Marie Dumont was a French Austrian who had a beautiful voice. She moved to America when she was 11, and she started out making a living here as a flower girl, selling flowers at a place called Healy's Flower Shop. And Healy's Flower Shop was not the only business that was there in the building. She was selling flowers in the front, but she was singing for the speakeasy patrons in the back, and that's how she got to know the bar business in New York City. And she eventually worked her way up, singing, waitressing, eventually owning some bars in New York. One of them we found one reference to a bar called the Paradise Inn, which she may have ran. But she did open up Marie's Crisis sometime in the late 20s, 1929-ish, and we found some reference definitely by the 30s. She was running Marie's Crisis, and the crisis, Marie's Crisis, the crisis portion of the name refers to Thomas Paine's The Crisis Papers.
That's right. And some of the regulars that were there during her time, especially in the 30s, was, of course, Walter Winchell, which we're showing here, who was a known gossip columnist at the time. He was bar hopping around, and he would often have a little column where he would just write what heard in the night was part of what it was called. And it was just little sentences of things he had heard at different bars. The Kit Kat Club was one that he would often talk about, and Marie's Crisis was another one where we would talk about things that were overheard at the bar there. I also found recently an article about Roy Johnson, who tried to defend the honor of Marie's Crisis Cafe when in 1936 when they were mugged. And the mugger held up the piano player and ended up going in and pulling the money out of the till, giving it to the mugger. And as the mugger was trying to leave, Roy threw a punch at the guy to try to slow him down. The guy ended up shooting poor Roy. He lived, but he was rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital. And the mugger, as far as we can tell, got away with it. But Johnson fell with a bullet in the left thigh. So there's always been some kind of excitement there, as much as it is now a big Broadway hangout. But obviously Thomas Paine is the person we're referring to there. And we refer to it because in that farmhouse that stood on that site in 1809 is where Thomas Paine had passed away. Obviously, he's best known for writing Common Sense. That was an article about why we should go to war. It was very well read, and people would read it and say, oh, that makes sense. And so war began. We didn't do so well, and that's when the crisis papers came around, when he felt there was a need for reinstilling some fervor into the revolution. And that was where the beginning of the crisis papers began. Here's a picture of his death mask, as his body has a whole other mysterious story, another statue there. But you can see here, so this is 3 different shots of the maps of that area. So when he passed away in 1809, the farmhouse was in the middle really of a field on just what was a footpath at that time. He had been staying at a place on Herring Street. Here's a little shot of the house that used to exist there, what is now Bleecker Street. It was Herring Street at the time. This is what it looks like now. Makes me sad. But the eventually became Burroughs Street, and then when they tore the building down, they changed it to Grove Street, partially because they were concerned that Burroughs Street and Barrow Street were going to get confused with each other. But it gives you a sense of how this has changed over time a little bit. And then the crisis papers are probably really best well known for these opening lines, which you may recognize, that started the very first of the crisis papers.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and women. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated.
Thomas Paine.
Papers.
Yeah.
And on that note, we were going to wrap up our presentation portion, sticking pretty close to about 40 minutes. Obviously, this is a much longer version that we will do, and we will do again when all of this passes by. And I appreciate you taking some of the time during this pandemic to spend with us. And as we figure out some ways to continue to do and keep these stories alive until we're back into it, I wanted to show you, here's a little map of the 1807, I believe. And this is the path that we've just done on the early version of the village. So we started here between Hammond and Bank Street. We walked all the way over here to where Grove will eventually intersect with all this areas. And then we ended here on what will eventually be Grove Street for Marie's Crisis Cafe. And when we think about why we do this tour, why we keep this literary pub crawl going, why we talk about writers that more and more are getting forgotten, and why we want to keep the spirit alive, it is because of that. It is because we forget. We forget who these writers were. We remember their names. We forget what they wrote. We forget the conditions that they were living in when they were writing what they were writing. And we forget why they were writing and how much of our lives that we experience now are because of that. And I can't think of any better example of that than the village poet Emma Lazarus, who wrote, "Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and whose name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that the Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." We forget. And I'd like to hope that for the last 40 minutes, we helped you remember. And thank you.
Yes, cheers, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
And if there are any questions, I think Ariel is going to manage all of this for us. And yeah, we'd love to.
Yes, cheers to Ariel for putting this all together.
Yes.
Cheers.
I'd also like to state that I did not create the polls.
In defense.
Very good.
It looks like we're getting lots of thanks, but no questions. Oh, wait, here we go. What year was Herring Street changed to Bleecker Street?
I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. I'd have to do a little bit of research. I want to say it was probably the real late 1800s or the early 1900s, because it was Borough Street somewhere in between. But I'd have to do some digging to find out the exact year. Oh, I see Sam is saying 1829. Thank you, Sam.
Wow,
nice.
Great work.
1829. Yeah, that's earlier than I would have thought. I live in Queens, and the street that I live on was a named street up until about 1910, and so it was always under. I always assumed that a lot of the streets were changed from, that they had their last like large name change around the turn of the century. So 1829 is earlier than I would have thought for New York City.
Yeah.
Someone also wants to know if you know what the fight between Bob Dylan and Andy Warhol was about.
Yes. Well, so Andy Warhol told the woman Edie Sedgwick that he did not think she should date Bob Dylan. He thought that Bob Dylan was going to end up cheating on her, was going to break her heart, it was going to leave her on the wayside, it was going to be all over the news. was going to be very public and you know, really upsetting to her, and that she should just avoid it. And Bob Dylan took offense to this. She didn't listen. Andy was right. But in the meantime, this sort of fight ensued in between. But it was a very public and an unfortunate breakup for Edie Sedgwick.
Yeah, Edie Sedgwick was a girlfriend of one and the muse of the other. And there's a great what's the name of that movie? Factory Girl. Is that it about her life?
Oh yeah,
That's a cool movie that sort of talks about Edie Sedgwick and that time period in the Village. It's kind of a neat movie.
Somebody else wants to know if there are places in between the stops on the walking tour that are cool, where you stop to point out that we could experience a little bit now.
Well, you know, I don't have anything visual set up, and it's definitely something that we could explore. But our standard tour, we have a few different variants of routes, but we do kind of walk through. Let me see how quickly I can pull up.
Eric, see if you can do an interpretive dance of these stops in between the bar. That would be lovely. See if you can do this right here. This is the buildings, the old bit. I don't know.
I might have to get the whole bottle for this.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
Definitely. I think we all do.
Usually we'll leave White Horse Tavern. We'll go down. We'll head south on Hudson and take a left onto Perry Street, where we'll talk about a building that Henry Miller lived in for a while and that Don Powell lived in for a while. We love the Stein. We
make reference all along Perry Street. We also make reference to H.P. Lovecraft, who lived in a building for a short time there too, which is kind of great.
We'll hit Patchen Place, which is kind of a fun one, has a lot of interesting stories, and we keep learning more and more about that kind of neighborhood. You know, E. Cummings gets the plaque, but Juna Barnes was really an iconic resident there, as was John Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, which actually I have right here, which is about the Russian Revolution, and I've been dying to do that.
Yes, you have. You were able to work in the rolling. That's good. That's very impressive.
But he was sort of a member of the Communist Party back in the 19 teens and 20s. Really part of the iconic time period of the Village. Really, you know, the Village has all these different times where there's a lot of things going on. But I think what cemented the Village in fame is between 1915 and 1925. And Reed was part of that movement, and he's one of the only Americans that actually gets sent over to Russia during the Russian Revolution to cover it and report upon it and write about what was happening. And this book is really fascinating, especially with what we know now about what happened over there, because it was very much a firsthand look at the revolution, talking to the soldiers, the privates, the small business owners, the locals, rather than just dealing with the politicians in the top line. And you see, you know, for me, the really poignant moment is when Vladimir Lenin realized that a free press was not going to work well if you're trying to cement power. And so he took control of the press and denied the free press, which I always think is important for us to remember how important a free press is. And that is my soapbox. But yeah, and then from there we go by the Northern Dispensary, we go through Gay Street, and it kind of depends on which guide is running the tour at the time. We are looking at trying to create a few other sort of, you know, non-drinking walks on some of the stuff we do, and this is our first attempt to feel out what works virtually, you know, what is a good length of time that people are comfortable sitting down and listening and what have you. Must get a t-shirt. Katerina. You can email us at general@literarypubcrawl.com if you are interested in any of our mugs, t-shirts, or shot glasses. We are also on Facebook, Lit Pub Crawl. We're on Twitter, Lit Pub Crawl, and we're on Instagram, Lit Pub Crawl. So you can find us there, and we often use the hashtag #GetLitWithUs.
How do you feel about taking one more question?
Sure.
More questions?
Yeah. Time.
Sure. Yeah.
Somebody wants to know, let's see. Were the bars open during Prohibition? Which happened 100 years ago in January.
Yes,
oh man,
right.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere. No, I was just, well, one of the bars that we used to go to, which was one of my favorite bars, was Chumley's. And we used to love talking about speakeasies and the history of speakeasies and what was going on. during the time of Prohibition. What was it, 1919 to 1933, and which is so much longer than if you think about it, that's a lot of time that Prohibition was in effect. I think the amount of illegal establishments that were selling alcohol jumped to, what was it, almost 100,000, more than 100,000.
They say there were
from like
16,000 places that sold alcohol in New York
at the
pre-Prohibition,
beginning.
and about 100,000 that sold alcohol after Prohibition.
Amazing. So yeah, so some of the bars were Chumley's certainly was, and White Horse. I would say the White Horse probably was.
I found an article about just recently where it was about, there was a famous Christmas raid in, I'm going to blank the year. I want to say it might have been 1928 or 1929, where Christmas Eve, the feds came in and raided a ton of New York City drinking establishments, several owned by Texas Guinan and Tommy Guinan, who we often talk about in our Times Square tour, but they were big up in the Midtown area. And the White Horse Tavern was one of the ones that was listed as getting fined in 1925 is the year that this Christmas Eve one happened.
Okay.
And there's actually another fun article I found, because the story from what we've been able to research is that Marie Dumont opened Marie's Crisis Cafe in 1929. And that's the accepted belief in a lot of the history books. I did find an article where they suggested that she was celebrating her 25th anniversary being there in 1958, which would have made her 1933, which makes me suspicious that she publicly announced that she started opening this cafe when it was legal again in 1933. Kettle of Fish was not around during Prohibition. I think Kettle of Fish got started, I want to say in the 50s. So it was sort of after that time period. And the Lion's Head opened in 1966 or 67. So those would have been post-Prohibition years. But we used to also go to the Minetta Tavern, which is still opening. And when they changed owner, we had a celebrity chef move in. It was a little tricky working out the timings, but they were the Black Rabbit for a while on the corner of Minetta Street, Minetta Lane and McDougal Street. And while they were the Black Rabbit, underneath it was the founding presses for the Reader's Digest magazine. So the condensed conservative novel got its start underneath a bunch of drunken bohemians illegally drinking.
Right. The Ear Inn is probably one of the older bars that we sadly don't talk about. The Ear Inn, but it used to be known as the Green Door. I imagine they were probably selling some alcohol as well. One of the cool things that I like about the Ear Inn is that when the Ear Inn first started, the edge of Manhattan was a lot closer to the Ear Inn, and then as skyscrapers were built, a lot of the earth that you dig out in order to make the foundation of the skyscrapers were added on to Battery Park City, of course, but also to one side of that side of Manhattan. And so now the shoreline is not so close to the Ear Inn anymore. It's kind of far away. But they were probably a speakeasy as well. Yeah,
and sailors are a great source for drinking as what is that, Sailors Week? Why can't I think of it? Navy Week. What's the week where sailors come out?
Fleet Week.
Thank you,
Fleet
my
Week.
God.
Yes, Fleet Week.
It's only one beer.
Right.
Fleet Week. Fleet Week. Thank you, Camber. Yeah. Fleet Week is what was the joke we used to say? Fleet Week was the 1 week of the year where women either stayed in or went out drinking, depending on where your status was at that time. But yeah, in fact, the White Horse was allegedly a big hangout for the longshoremen during Prohibition, and a lot of husbands were coming home late from work regularly. And one of our guides, Christy, her grandfather was apparently a longshoreman on the Hudson River that drank during Prohibition, and her grandmother refuses to talk about those years.
That's good. Oh yeah, I forgot about that story. Yeah, that's right.
Have you all been in the White Horse since it was remodeled on the inside? Yes. What's it like in there?
They changed the floor.
They changed the floor. They took some things off the walls. Changing these bars when they change owners is always hard for us, because we've been going to these bars for 20 years, and even in just the last 20 years, there's been so many changes. This is probably the newest large change to one of the great historical bars. They altered. I know that they redid the kitchen in the back. You wouldn't necessarily see that, but they did take out some of the decor inside and spruced it up a bit. They changed the tables. They changed the chairs.
Increase
And
the prices.
and they're really cultivating a different clientele. I've definitely noticed that the age of the clientele has dropped. A lot of younger people have been going inside, and that's by design. They're specifically trying to get a younger clientele to go into the bar. Which I mean, for a business, it's good for business. But for those of us who wish that nothing ever changes and that everything stays the absolute same without evolving ever at all, because change is scary. It's kind of a bummer.
No, and I mean, what I found is the changes were annoying, but not major, and it still in many ways feels the same. I think the floor now, it's like a black and white checkered floor, and I love the old floors, but that's also my own aesthetic. I am curious because it was a fairly pricey deal. I mean, the building and the business went for $14 million, and that was only like a year before this pandemic hit. So, I guess if you can buy a building for $14 million, you're probably a little more financially secure than myself, that I stick to like $10 million buildings. But I am
That's
curious.
True. My collection of $10-11 million buildings.
I was talking to one of our other guys yesterday, and I think the bigger concern for me is just like, what businesses are going to survive this time period? And it really depends on whether or not the landlords are forgiving on rents and helping out that a little bit, which would be nice because that is the spirit of the Village. In fact, the reason why the Village was such a sort of bohemian literary and artistic hotspot was, I think it's best encapsulated with an out-of-print book, The Improper Bohemians.
Do it again. You know you want to. Do it again.
I lost it.
Yes.
The first chapter of the book, Impossible Bohemians, is entitled Because the Rents Were Cheap. And what you started to learn is that there were a lot of people who were letting the writers go rent-free for a while until they could get the money, that it was very much a neighborhood community for a long time. So that would be a nice spirit if they could do that, but I do wonder what we'll have available for bars once this passes and we're all able to actually see each other again. Yes, he is, and he is known as he's not a nice person. I'm very upset about that. If I had a time machine, there are many bars that I would own in Greenwich Village.
Yeah.
Forget going back to the dinosaur or the revolution, all this stuff. I'd go back to 1900 and start buying out some great bars in the Village.
I like that very much. Cool. Amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, this was super fun.
Yeah.
This is the first attempt. Yeah. We would definitely, if you have feedback to send over to Ariel, we wouldn't mind having her filter through it a little bit. But East Village Pub Trail Marjorie, all right, you got it. We'll work on it. We have a few author-specific tours that we want to kind of pull through. But it's good to know, like, one of the things that we were trying to feel out too is, we tried to keep it at 40 minutes, with allowing us a little bit of time to go over and have some time for questions to stay within an hour time frame, because that feels like
so our butts don't fall asleep. That's always a concern.
But it'd be good to know if you felt like you would have been up for more information, if you felt like it was the right amount. Like, that would be some good logistical stuff as we try to learn this new format that we're going through.
And I'm gonna send out the video of this and a follow-up survey, so I'll include some of those questions in the survey.
Oh, cool. Yeah, if Eric should wear funny hats, we should definitely know that sort of stuff. That's very important.
I don't know if you're gonna say your name right, but Lenny, you're absolutely good quote, and I wouldn't be lying to say if I didn't send those poll questions to her maybe 10 minutes before we started, when she was like, "You're gonna have polls." I'm like, "Oh shoot, right, polls."
Polls.
We'll be better prepared for some of that, and even the PowerPoint presentation was getting updated seconds before we started. Danielle didn't even know the picture was coming in, so. Thank you. That's great feedback.
Yeah.